Hi there, happy to see you on this Sunday. Another large demonstration in Toronto this past weekend in solidarity with anti-regime protests that continue in Iran. It has now been 1 month since the death of Mahsa Amini, who died after she was arrested by the so-called morality police. Her death sparked widespread protests across Iran that continue even today. The Canadian government has sanctioned officials there following the violent crackdown on demonstrators. The government now working to implement measures to bar thousands of members of the Islamic regime, the Islamic Guard rather, from Canada. I spoke with Public Safety Minister Marco Mendicino about those measures just this morning. Good morning, Minister. Nice to see you.
Good morning.
I just want to start maybe just by getting your reaction to the fire that we saw overnight at Evin Prison in Tehran. There are reports of deaths and some casualties. Just your thoughts on seeing those pictures and concerns that you might have.
I saw those images as well overnight, and they're shocking to say the least. It's my understanding that that's where many political prisoners, women and families who are marching for women's rights in Iran have been put into custody. And look, this is a month after the brutal killing of Mahsa Amini, which is why it's so imperative that we continue to do everything possible to stand with him in solidarity. As you know, we put in place some additional comprehensive sanctions, including the designation not only of the IRGC, but of the entirety of the Iranian regime as a serial violator of human rights and as a facilitator of terrorism, with the express objective of ensuring that those who are most responsible will never be able to set foot in Canada again or use this country as a safe haven. We're expanding economic sanctions, and we're allocating significant federal funding to put the boots on the ground with the RCMP and others so we can make good on those sanctions. And it's important. I've listened very carefully to some human rights activists, including members of the Iranian Canadian diaspora with whom I met just last week, Rosie. There's no way to convey how serious and how grave the situation is there. So we're going to march with them, we're going to stand with them, and we're going to do everything that we can to defend their human rights.
So let's talk a little bit about some of those measures. Does using IRPA, which is the way that you have decided you will keep these people out of the country and designate them, have the same effect as if you were going to designate them as a terrorist entity? And I ask you that because if you list an organization or people as a terrorist entity, it does allow you to do other things like freeze assets and even go after people that are making financial contributions to those organizations. So does it have the same impact and range of consequences?
Well, I would argue that the designation under IRPA allows us to be much more targeted, and it actually allows us to denounce the entirety of the regime in a way that the criminal code might not be fit for purpose. And I assure you and your viewers and all Canadians that as a result of the work that CBSA is doing around the clock right now so that we can make that designation under IRPA will allow for concrete sanctions to be put into place, including rendering individuals who are most responsible for these transgressions as inadmissible. And that is a very powerful sanction that we can impose. We also have the capacity to freeze and seize assets of those individuals who have been named under CIMA. And we're putting $76 million on the front lines, adding up to 30 new police officers and experts so that we can implement these sanctions effectively. Now, I know that there are those who have argued for the criminal code listing. As you know, Rosie, I was a federal prosecutor for about a decade. I know how that act applies. I will say that in this particular instance, at this particular time, this designation will allow us to implement the sanctions that we need to put into place so that we can defend human rights and ensure that Canada will never be used as a safe haven.
But just to my specific point there around assets, okay, you can freeze the assets of the people that you're going to designate, but if someone is trying to send money to those people or to the IRGC, are those people then able to be prosecuted or no?
Yes, and that's why we're adding resources to the RCMP so that they can advance investigations. And of course, there are other provisions under the criminal code which do allow for individuals to have their assets seized. There are FinTrack powers that allow law enforcement to track the funding of proceeds of crime, which could advance the Iranian regime's interests. All of those provisions are in place, and we're simply expanding our capacity to ensure that we leave no stone unturned so we can hold those who are most responsible accountable for those transgressions.
So you say that CBSA and others, I imagine, are working on this list of up to 10,000 people. How close are you to being done that list? Are you working with allies like the United States, for instance, to come up with the people that you're trying to go after?
Well, there's robust intelligence sharing among our allies and our friends, and I do want to tell you that I've certainly communicated the urgency with which we need to conclude this process. I'm confident we're going to be able to make that designation in the short term, but I also want to underline for your viewers that we have already taken concrete action through sanctions. We are leading on the world stage. You heard last week that Minister Joly will be convening like-minded foreign ministers in Canada to better coordinate those efforts around the world. Former Minister Goodale, now High Commissioner to the United Kingdom, met with a number of other like-minded countries to ensure that we are holding the Iranian regime accountable for the downing of PS 752. As you know, at the time I held the immigration portfolio, we ensured that families could be together to grieve together, to repatriate bodies. We also opened up new pathways so that those who were in Iran who lost somebody that they loved could come to Canada to visit and even stay permanently if they chose to do so. So this is on top of a number of other concrete actions that we are doing to support the families of PS 752 and more broadly, Rosie, the women. And I have to tell you, again, I did meet very directly with a number of the Iranian Canadian community here. And, you know, the most anxious thing that they communicated to me was that they didn't want to be alone, and that they wanted to know that the government was going to be there to support them. And I've been able, I hope to transmit to them through these actions and through everything else that we're doing that we are going to stand with them.
Will you also go after family members of the IRGC? If, for instance, there were people here on student visas or working visas, and you understood that perhaps their family members were contributing to this, were part of the regime, would you also ask them to leave?
Well, those are decisions that will be undertaken by our colleagues at Immigration, Refugee, Citizenship Canada, and there are provisions that do allow for family members who are related to those responsible for the atrocities or for supporting or facilitating the atrocities that are being committed in Iran to be removed as well. And I suppose that's the most important thing for people to take away from this, which is that we're going to leave no recourse unturned. We're going to leave no effort to spared here.
Right.
We're looking at all of the available authorities to make sure that Canada cannot be a backyard for in any way perpetrating or supporting the violations which are going on in Iran.
And not to belabor the timeline, but just so I'm clear, you've said you want it done quickly. There is some urgency, obviously, to doing it. So what would you say is your timeline in terms of when you think this will be in place? And in practice,
certainly not
I guess,
years.
Yeah.
Yeah, certainly not years or months. I think we're looking at weeks, and you know, as soon as we've got something more to say about that, we will. But again, I do want to emphasize that this is in addition to a number of other concrete measures that we are taking and have taken against Iran, including showing leadership on the world stage, bringing like-minded countries together to show solidarity.
Minister, before I let you go, I do want to ask you about the Emergencies Act inquiry, which started last week. One of the things that struck me in those first days were lawyers from Alberta and Saskatchewan who said that they had not been consulted when the act was invoked, but rather they were just told. So I wonder what you make of that interpretation and what you say to that.
Well, the first thing I would say to take us all back was that this was an unprecedented public order emergency, and we invoked the Emergencies Act because it was necessary to restore public order, not only at a number of border communities, but equally at the seat of our federal government in Ottawa. And I would say that there is a very transparent record of the consultations that both me and a number of colleagues across government undertook, including with provinces and territories, including with our American counterparts prior to to the invocation of the Emergencies Act. I think that the commission is now on its way is a good thing. This is an important part of the way in which we can be transparent about the way in which we took that decision, which we took reluctantly and used it for a short period of time, and then we revoked it as quickly as we could. So I look forward, and I know others are very much looking forward in the federal government to cooperating with Judge Rouleau so that we can take whatever lessons are necessary from this very difficult moment, so that we never have to invoke that act again.
Okay, thanks, Minister. I appreciate your time today.
Thank you very much, Rosemary.